All right, so Mr. Gerber here. So we're going over the beginnings of Unit 2. This is the Cold War unit. So hopefully you've taken a look already at our introduction video about, how to go through the unit, where to find stuff. So today we're just kind of going over the very beginnings here. So this would be kind of going over section 1 in the study guide, kind of looking at the beginnings of the Cold War, and then, kind of bank off some other things there too. So, the unit goals here. So our big things that we want to take away from the unit. So analyzing the technological and societal changes that affected popular culture in the post-World War II era. So this is where we're looking at, changes inside the United States in terms of societal changes. And that's going to be something we go on throughout. We're not going to really talk about that here necessarily, but we're going to talk about that more in the coming lessons, and it goes all the way through the Vietnam War. So for those that really like the 60s and hippie culture and all that, that's going to be something we're going to come back to. So we're going to compare and contrast the two styles of economic systems. So the market economy, which is the democratic and U.S. Economic style, and the command style, which is more the Soviet/communist style, and their associated political ideology. So what they believe in, that's what we're going to go over today, and explain how these differences contributed to the development of the Cold War. We're also going to look at the role, or we're going to analyze the role of the United States in Southeast Asia, so that includes the Vietnam War, and evaluate the impact of our domestic response to the war. So those are kind of our big goals, and then there's a lot of stuff in between that covers a lot of that, all that stuff that we just kind of mentioned here with our big unit goals. So for today, we want to come up with our essential questions. So understand the systems and institutions set up after World War II to help rebuild Europe and prevent World War III. So we're going to come back to in the next lesson as well as describing what factors led to the Cold War. So we would kind of go over here what were the factors that led to World War II and what steps could have been done to prevent it. So just kind of a brief recap here. So we're looking at Germany at the end of World War I. Okay, they lost territory. Qing had to get a new form of government that was very weak. They had to pay reparations, so they had to pay money to countries that were affected by World War I that kept Germany weak. So that's essentially Belgium, France, Great Britain. They had to take full responsibility for the war. They had to limit the size of their military and where it could be located. Now, as we know, in many cases, that limitation in terms of that appeasement with the military did not go very well. All right, the Germans resented the loss of territory. They did not like the new form of government. Again, it was very weak, couldn't really handle the pressure. The reparations kept the German economy very weak and actually in a state of depression long before the Great Depression hit in every other country. And that would all, in fact, lead to the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. All right, so other things that looked at or that caused World War II. So going into more Japan and Italy. Hard economic times led to the rise of dictators in fascist countries. So especially in Italy right away, where they hit hard economic times right away after the end of World War II, long before the Great Depression, but again hitting on Germany and Japan. Okay, that high inflation, unemployment, lack of trade, a lot of it due to tariffs, led to a lot of mistrust and a lot of focus on what you can do for your country but not for others. Okay, the League of Nations, which was designed to prevent any further conflict, does not prevent military takeovers, and a lot of countries favored appeasement and argued for isolationism. So think about, all those countries giving in to Hitler or kind of letting him do what he wanted in terms of, hey, Hitler just wants the Sudetenland where all the Germans are in Czechoslovakia. Why not? Hitler wants to, rearm his people. Why not? We don't really want to focus on that. It's just kind of an empty threat. It's not worth going to war over. It's not worth going into war with Japan over the issue of Manchuria and China. It's not worth fighting over Ethiopia and Italy, even though these are all countries that are involved in the League of Nations. So very ineffective in that sense. Okay. So now we're going to go over kind of our quick beliefs here in terms of the communist and Soviet beliefs versus the American and capitalist beliefs. So kind of understanding the ideologies in terms of both politics and economics. So for those that don't know anything about communism, here's kind of a quick crash course on this, and we'll talk about how the Soviet Union is a little bit different from that. So the communist belief is that the government should be in control of the economy to make things fair and equal, because you couldn't trust private industries or individuals. It's the government's job to ensure that everyone essentially gets what they need and is treated equally with economics and not just, social and political rights. Okay. There should be no private ownership of land, factories, resources. Everything should be equally owned and shared by all the people. All right, now for some people they're thinking, hey, this sounds like socialism. It's not. Okay, those are not the same things. They're often associated with the same things, but there is a difference. We're not going to talk about that here. But just so you know, socialism and communism are not the same thing. All right. You can definitely do your own research on that. So within our own belief systems here with the communists, you have the actual beliefs of the Soviet Union, all right? Because yes, of course, in the Soviet Union, while the government is in control of all this, there is still private ownership, okay? But overall, what they are looking for is to keep Germany weak, all right? They are very frightened of a very strong German country and nation, and they want a buffer zone of communist countries between them and Germany. So essentially, in case Germany ever becomes strong again, they want a number of countries that are going to have their back to ensure that the Soviet Union / Russia is not the target for a third straight world war, right? Because Russia has been devastated by the two previous ones, right? And that is what they want to avoid at the most. So they believe that communism is obviously superior to capitalism. That is why they are the Soviet Union. That's why they have a capitalist country and government. And they fear that capitalist countries like the United States will try to get rid of communism. All right, we'll take a look at some primary examples here from primary docs in kind of near the end here. Something we would go over more in class if we had the time with some pretty in-depth kind of documents. All right, that would take more time in class, but we'll just kind of talk about them here in a little bit. So the American and capitalist beliefs is that economic growth with trade will lead to world peace, because at the end of World War I, the United States went back into isolationism. We started putting up tariffs. Other countries did the same. And that did not help in terms of the Depression and kind of led to countries kind of being on their own. So if we're more interconnected, so the more globalization that we have, the more what goes on with one country goes on with other countries. We're all in this together. We're going to care about what happens in other countries because money ties us all together, right? So economic trade will lead to peace. But we also, as the United States and other capitalist countries, we believe in private property. All right, unfortunately, I wrote property in here twice now. I've now noticed that. Hopefully, I'll change that after this. But also individual ownership and free enterprise. So the ability to run your own company and do what you want with it with limited government interference or intervention. So less laissez-faire, for the most part, would lead to the greatest wealth and less inequality. All right, now, obviously, there are different strands in that, as we've talked about that through the progressive unit and everything for trimester 2. But again, more private ownership is the better option here. All right. So how the U.S. begins to increase its role in the world economy and not fall back into that isolationist, standpoint after World War I. They don't want to repeat of that following World War II. Okay, belief that the tariffs led to the Great Depression. All right, so what they do in part is to establish these two institutions that are still here today, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. All right, these aren't vocab terms, but they're just good things to be aware of, and they're on the study guide in terms of the economic part, to help rebuild after World War II with loans for infrastructure, helping to increase investment and trade to prevent further wars. So helping countries kind of rebuild with the necessary things, all right? Because if you've got a bunch of resources, but you don't have the means of getting it, like you can't extract it, if you can't have roads or bridges or airports or seaports to kind of transport this stuff and get trade with other countries, then it's kind of useless. So this is going to help rebuild that and help increase investment within these countries to, again, bring in more wealth, again, increase that trade. Okay. So also we're going to create the United Nations, which we kind of mentioned at the very end of the World War II unit, to replace the League of Nations. So again, hopefully to force the world powers to work together to solve problems and prevent war. We'll look at how that actually works. It is limited due to the power of the Security Council. All right, because any action has to have unanimous consent. And when you have opposing viewpoints in countries like the United States and the Soviet Union, that becomes a bit of a constraint. Even now today with the United States and regular Russia, as well as communist China, we have had problems getting the Security Council to act. We'll talk about one big success here with the next lesson. So preparing for post-World War II world, essentially, so looking at it from the political aspect. So at the Yalta Conference, this is before World War II actually ends. We still have Franklin Delano Roosevelt as president. He just gets elected to his 4th term. He'll pass away, unfortunately, in about 2 months. Goes to Yalta, which is in Russia, all right, and meets with Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and the current Soviet head, still Joseph Stalin. So they all agree that all of Europe can determine their own form of government. So self-determination, like we talked about related to World War I, through elections. Okay, every country gets to decide for themselves what kind of government they want to have. They also agree on dividing Germany and Berlin into 4 separate zones for a time that's going to be individually controlled by the 4 victors of Europe. So the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. All right, so you can kind of see that over here, Great Britain in this section, the United States over here, France along their border with Germany, and then the Soviet Union here in the east, Berlin divided up along the exact same kind of division. All right, it's only supposed to be part-time. Germany will pay reparations, but with trade goods and not products, or sorry, trade goods and products, not money like they did after World War I. So Germany will have to help rebuild because a lot of their infrastructure and industries here in the West that has been heavily damaged, but not beyond repair. And that stuff will be sent out to the Allied countries and the victors to help rebuild. So Germany will have to spend time investing and building stuff for other countries as kind of a result of their things that they did here in World War II. So things that they have to give away, railroad cars, food, tractors, industrial machinery, they have to give away, but also use to create and give to these other countries. All right. So they want to keep German industries and the economy intact so that they don't end up essentially, angry and bitter after World War II. All right. So at the Potsdam Conference later on, so this goes a few months later, Germany has surrendered. Japan is on the verge of surrendering. So now we have Harry Truman, who has been president now for the last 3 months or so, since FDR passed away. He was vice president, so that's kind of how he stepped up here. So Truman is put in charge of the United States. All right, meets at Potsdam, and essentially they don't really determine anything. So Potsdam is this little suburb here in Berlin. Can't really see it on these maps, but it's just right outside Berlin. And essentially what they agree to is just, again, putting more of this stuff down to paper. There's nothing really big that happens at Potsdam, other than the Soviets agreed to the industry reparations instead of just punishing all of Germany, which is what they want to do. All right, they establish a new border between Germany and Poland, as you can see here. All right, then on top of that, the Soviets are not necessarily very forthcoming because a lot of the Soviet militaries are still in Eastern Europe, all right, which is something we're going to play in later and have a lot of issues to deal with, because while the Soviets helped liberate much of Eastern Europe, the Allies much of Southern Europe with Italy, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Austria, the Soviets are not leaving or not removing their military, all right, and in Poland in particular, they've been supporting the Communist Party and essentially have like a rigged election to put a Communist Party in charge, which is, again, the idea that, we're going to let the Europeans form their own governments through elections, and they voted, but again, they are not necessarily allowing free elections in these countries. So what we begin to see is a bunch of Soviet countries or Soviet puppet states that are communist popping up throughout Eastern and Central Europe, which the United States does not like, as there is a mistrust between them. All right. At this point, we also know that Harry Truman is aware of the atomic bombs. He has yet to use them on Japan, but he does not necessarily mention to the Soviet Union that he has them. All right. So here's kind of our big three at the Yalta Conference: the frail, very close to death, FDR, Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin. Potsdam, here's Harry Truman, Stalin, Churchill. Churchill, actually, his government gets voted out in Great Britain, so he gets kind of replaced at the very end of the conference by Clement Attlee in the British government. All right. So to kind of lay that in, all right, so that covers a lot of the stuff here right away from the very beginning of the unit. So one thing that we're going to look at here are two quick things. You kind of see my video screen here. Is just the big differences between these countries. All right. There's a genuine mistrust between them for what they truly believe in. So Soviet belief and thinking. Essentially, this is the extra readings that are in this section. All right, so George Kennan, this goes more and more within the second section, an American diplomat who has been living and working with the Soviet Union for a long time, writes in 1946 that essentially the Soviet Union is very paranoid about, capitalism and the United States. They think that we are going to essentially try to encircle them so that there can't be a coexistence, all right, that we are going to cause a lot of problems. We're going to have eventual war because they don't believe that we can actually work together. All right. So they believe, this is the Kennan's belief of the United States, or the Soviets thinking of the United States, committed to a belief that is desirable and necessary for the internal harmony of their society, meaning the Soviet society, to be disrupted and their traditional life destroyed. All right. Then Andrei Zadonov, or Zadnov, this is also in the textbook and also on the page, believes that essentially we are going to prop up governments and start wars throughout other places to essentially continue on imperialism and continue our wealth of power at the expense of the Soviet Union. So we're going to kind of see how this plays out in the further lessons.